Stop me, 'cause I'm having a good time, having a good time. I'm a shooting star leaping through the sky like a tiger, defying the laws of gravity.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Whatcast. This is the first part of our look at the universal cards that are going to be available in the Spiteclaw Swarm expansion for Warhammer Underworlds Shadespire. Now, the idea behind this series is that I have literally just opened this. I have not seen any of these cards prior to now unless they've been featured on Warhammer Community. So what I wanted to share with people was my unvarnished, immediate reaction upon seeing each of these cards and just my initial thoughts on how they might affect the meta going forward. Okay, so first off, we're looking, in this part of the video, we're going to be looking at the objective cards. And our first one is Alone in the Darkness. Score this in an end phase if there are no adjacent fighters on the battlefield. Okay, so there's been an increasing trend for keep-away style play. There was a very well-received Stormcast deck that was entirely defensive and based on staying away from your opponent. This is going to synergize very well with that, as well as the specific objectives like Consecrated Area that Stormcast have. Based on what I've seen in Spiteclaw's Swarm, they're going to be able to do a similar thing. And this might also work well for Sepulchral Guard. That being said, it's nice that this is going to give you 2 glory points, but the important thing to remember here is that there have to be no adjacent fighters, including your enemy. You can't have your enemy have any of his guys adjacent to each other. And the problem, there's a couple of problems with this. One is that it's based less on what you're doing and more about what your opponent is doing. Second, in order to keep your opponent from having anybody adjacent, you're usually going to have to go in and actively break their units apart. And usually you're going to do that by going up and smacking somebody, which is going to work against your goal. Now, there are several ways to get around this. You have a number of ranged weapons, you have ploys that can break people up, and this will also be very useful either in the first phase when people are just starting to get positioned and they don't have their defensive line set up, or in the third phase when there's fewer units on the battlefield. You'll note that there is no stipulation here that there has to be a certain number of fighters in play for this to come into effect. Again, very good and synergistic for certain playstyles. I myself usually don't try to do a keep-away style deck because I prefer a more aggressive playstyle, but this may work out great for you. Okay, Butchery. Score this in an end phase if your warband took 3 or more enemy fighters out of action in the preceding action phase. So previously to now, we have seen a bunch of objectives based around taking out 2 enemy fighters or taking out 1 enemy fighter with your leader. Those can be difficult to pull off. Taking out 3 is going to be extremely difficult, but less so with the new factions that are out. With the Chosen Axes and the in Spiteclaw's Swarm, you're going to have a lot more on the field to kill. But at the same time, this card is going to be near useless to you if you're playing against a faction that has very few models comparatively. For example, Stormcast, Orcs, and this runs into the same problem as many other very difficult to achieve objectives. If you've managed to achieve this objective, you've probably been playing well enough to already win. I would definitely keep an eye on this in the future, considering it is any end phase and 2 glory points. As the meta changes, we may see a lot more horde-style factions that work similar to the Sepulchral Guard or Spiteclaw's Swarm, or even Khorne Bloodbound. It'll be interesting to see how this develops. Cover ground. Score this immediately if a friendly fighter makes a move action of 6 or more hexes. Okay, so this is really built for combos. It's going to be very easy to pull this off with Khorne Bloodbound or Spiteclaw Swarm. And it's also worth mentioning this is a score immediate, so it's going to be very effective in the first turn. However, you are going to need to play something, either an upgrade or a ploy, that is going to give you at least one more movement. To me, the first thing that comes to mind is Sprint, which actually is going to open this up for use by anybody with a movement value of 3 or better. For instance, Ironjaw's, Stormcast, and anything else they might produce in the future that has a movement value of 3. Even, I believe Sepulchral Guard go to 3 movement once they've inspired. And so do the Fire Slayers, which, unfortunately, that is adding a few more moving parts. What I like about this is that this can be done with one moving part, that is the sprint ploy. But we can imagine there are going to be multiple avenues in order to get your units moving fast. And if your deck is built to increase movement speed, for example, with legendary swiftness, great speed, so on and so forth, this is going to be a very strong choice. I'm always a big fan of score immediately, because they let you get that initial critical objective to spend on an upgrade early in the first turn, and they open you up to gain even more objectives. Strong choice. Okay, Escalation. Score this in an end phase if 3 or more upgrade cards were played in the preceding action phase. 2 glory. So I'm already excited about this because as the game develops, there's going to be more of a focus on upgrades, and especially in your second turn, that's when a lot of upgrades are going to start hitting the table. Also, keep in mind that this does not stipulate who is putting the upgrades out. So if you put 1 and your opponent puts down 2, which is not that unlikely, this is going to be very easy to snake 2 glory points. Definitely a strong mid-game card, and a very versatile card. I can see this showing up in a lot of different decks as, honestly, filler. A very reliable, effective filler. Okay, moving on. Master of War. Score this in an end phase if you scored an objective card, played a ploy card, and played an upgrade card in this round. So that sounds like a lot of moving points, or moving parts, but if we really think about it, what this means is, did you have a good turn? Basically, you need to score 1 objective, which, honestly, that's the point of the game. You need to score an objective in preferably each turn. It's not difficult at all to play a ploy card if you've built your deck well. And in fact, at top level play, you're going to play at least 1 ploy card in each turn. And if you get that initial glory from accomplishing an objective, you're definitely going to put down at least 1 upgrade per turn. Again, this is another solid go into many different types of decks card. And this is also going to synergize well with a number of other upgrade specific objectives, as well as objectives to score other objectives. So far, just in the cards we've seen some very strong choices in this expansion. Okay, Miraculous Escape. Score this immediately if one of your fighters is the target of an enemy attack action with a dice characteristic of 3 or more that fails. Okay, Well, this This sounds difficult to pull off at first blush. However, there are a number of attacks in the game that are 3 daggers. And personally, I like the chances of having that fail with, anywhere upwards of 1 defense dice. For example, if you're playing Stormcast, or Spiteclaw Swarm, or I believe some of the Fire Slayers have the ability to go to 2 defense dice with upgrades. This is not really that difficult to pull off, especially if you're facing somebody whose primary attack metric is going to be daggers instead of hammers. And again, this is another score immediately. So with the rise of many objectives that want you to score 2 other objectives in 1 turn, this is going to make that a lot more possible. It's going to get you that early glory point to get those upgrades out. That being said, there are a lot of decks you're going to come across where this is going to be difficult or impossible to pull off. Ultimately, I think you're going to want to use this card if you're playing a faction that has the ability to go to 2 defense dice. Right off the bat, Spiteclaw Swarm, Stormcast, or a build focused on greatly increasing a single character's defense, which I've managed to do with Khorne Bloodbound. Looks like you'll be able to do with Fire Slayers. Really situational, but possibly very strong objective play. The bigger they are, score this immediately if a friendly fighter takes an enemy fighter out of action with an attack characteristic that has a damage characteristic of 1. So this is not terribly difficult to pull off. And again, this is yet another score immediately card, which seems to be a theme with this particular expansion. There is an increasing amount of abilities in the game that are going to do 1 damage. And it's very easy to take out chaff. I mean, despite the text, this doesn't have to be used on any particularly powerful enemies. This could be used against a petitioner who's only got 2 hit points, or Skaven Chaff, or Corn Chaff, all of which have 2 hit points. You just need to tag them with something once, and then tag them with another thing. And there are a number of abilities now that can do 1 damage to an enemy without having to do an attack roll. So you'll start them off with that to set them up, and then knock them down with this. That being said, you're looking at, unless you can pull this off with a ploy, you're looking at 2 activations to take out 1 enemy. Which that can be inefficient. It just depends on how the rest of your deck is structured and the board state at the time. Again, situational, but a very strong situational choice that's going to be extremely versatile. No more tricks. Score this in an end phase if you have no power cards in your hand. A lot of people may be turned off by that, but this isn't like the other objectives where you score it by not playing power cards. I typically find that if you have emptied out your hand by the end of the turn, you're playing it right. This means that your deck construction is strong, you have very useful ploys, and you're generating enough glory points to use all of your upgrades. The challenge here is going to be dumping the upgrades that you might have in your hand. It'll be interesting to see if we have mechanics coming out later that will cause discards in your hand. I would not be surprised if at some point a warband came out that had the ability to force enemy discards. This might be a nice counterplay to that. Okay, here's a big one. Overextended. Score this in an end phase if you hold every objective. We have seen this before. I think I think there's an undead specific objective around holding every objective. This is going to be extremely difficult to pull off, but with the advent of very objective focused warbands like the Chosen Axes, or very fast warbands like Spiteclaw Swarm, this might be very possible to pull off. Then the interesting thing is you could pull this off in turn 1 if you're fast enough and tricksy enough. And having a turn 1 or 2 bump of 5 glory points is going to give you a commanding lead in the game. It will probably win you the game right there. I would be surprised if a lot of your opponents didn't immediately forfeit after you achieve this objective. Again, though, this is going to take a very specific build, and I think as the meta evolves, people are going to be expecting this card. And I think at this point, if you very clearly are putting one of your figures on every objective, your opponent is going to know exactly what you're doing, and this is very easy to counter. You look at the warbands that are going to be able to pull this off. That's going to be Khorne Bloodbound, Spiteclaw Swarm, and if you have a lot of movement shenanigans, possibly Sepulchral Guard. But at the same time, each of those factions are very easy to kill a single chaff unit, which would ruin your whole plan. Ultimately, I think this guy is kind of a trap. Overextended is kind of a trap. The card text seems to literally indicate that. I'm not sure. I think this is one of those that's going to be nearly impossible to pull off in serious competitive play. Okay, up next we have Ready for a Challenge. Score this in an end phase if all remaining enemy fighters, at least 3, have an upgrade. Okay, I don't like this one. I don't like it because it's only 1 glory point. It is dependent on what your enemy is doing. It's dependent on your enemy having at least 3 figures still on the field, and your enemy being willing to spend upgrades on those figures. At this time, the only warband I can think of that might actually, the player might actually be willing to put upgrades on each is Stormcast, maybe Chosen Axes. But this is just too much of a corner case. It's going to be too rare to be one of your 12 objectives. So I'm a hard pass on this one. And finally, Tactical Genius 3 through 5. Finally, some objective love for objectives 4 and 5. Score this in an end phase if you hold objectives 3, 4, and 5. Okay, so 3 glory points and a great number of cards in the current meta with these 2 new expansions, allowing a lot of movement, a lot of objective swapping. I can see this as being a very strong play. I would wonder if it's a great idea to have this and all of the other multiple objective cards that exist. Your hold 5 objectives, your Tactical Supremacy, your Tactical Genius, Tactical Mastery. But in, say, for example, a Shade Collar deck with the new other ploy card that allows you to swap an objective, as well as high speed horde factions like Spiteclaw Swarm, this might be a strong play. Again, very situational. This is going to take a deck specifically built to accomplish this and other similar objectives. But if you can, the options for synergy are outstanding. Okay, so that is all of the universal the universal objectives from the Spiteclaw Swarm expansion for Warhammer Underworlds Shadespire. A lot of great stuff in here. This is probably some of the stronger universal objectives that I've seen in terms of how they are going to affect the meta. The biggest thing that I'm seeing here is that it's opening up a lot more new play styles and styles of decks, which is great because I was starting to feel that the meta was getting a touch stale in Shadespire. So these have come out at a perfect time. I really like what this is going to do to the competitiveness of the game. But for now, we're going to move on to our next video, where we will take a good look at the universal upgrades that are available in Spiteclaw's Swarm. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe for more Warhammer Underworlds Tactics content, and we'll see you in the next video.